morning, everyone. My name is Erin Chlopak, and I direct the campaign finance program at Campaign Legal Center, which is a nonpartisan, nonprofit organization here in town that works to advance democracy through law. I'm very excited to be here this morning to moderate our discussion on how money from secret, undisclosed sources influences U.S. elections. A defining feature of our political system in the United States is the role of private financing of elections, and of political campaigns in particular. The United States Constitution protects the freedom of speech, and the Supreme Court has said that spending to influence elections is a form of, quote, speaking. So our system protects the rights of individual citizens and even corporations to spend unlimited amounts of money to influence our elections, provided that the spending is not coordinated with the candidates that they're supporting. To be sure, our rules are much stricter when the money is given directly to candidates to spend themselves, but when money is used to support a candidate independently, and we'll talk a little bit about what that word independently means, not only are there no limits on how much can be spent, but it's also pretty easy to conceal the sources of where that money is coming from. So, what threats does that pose for corruption in our political system, and how does it affect the ability of voters to make informed decisions when they participate in our political process? And what does it mean about who is able to run for office? These are some of the many questions that we'll be talking about today with our distinguished panel of experts who are here to help us dig into these questions. So let me go ahead and introduce them. To my immediately sitting next to me is Beth Rotman, who is currently the executive director of the New York City Campaign Finance Board. Beth previously served as the founding director of the Connecticut Citizens Election Program and as the national director of the Money in Politics and Ethics Program at Common Cause. Beth's appointment as executive director of the New York City Campaign Finance Board marks her return to that campaign finance board where she previously served as deputy general counsel. Next, we have Saurav Ghosh, who is director of the Federal Campaign Finance Program at Campaign Legal Center, where he works with me. Before joining CLC, Saurav served in the Office of General Counsel at the Federal Election Commission. Saurav is an expert on campaign finance rules applicable to foreign nationals and generally about the U.S. campaign finance system. And he is deeply knowledgeable about the various avenues by which foreign interests seek to influence U.S. elections. And finally, next to Saurav is Meredith McCoy, who's currently counsel in the Political Law and Nonprofit Organizations Group at the law firm Venable. Meredith advises businesses, nonprofits, individuals, and political groups in their efforts to participate in public policy making and the political process. In addition to offering insights from the perspective of regulated entities and individuals, Meredith also brings her knowledge and experience as a former enforcement attorney in the Office of General Counsel at the Federal Election Commission, where she advised the commission on complex enforcement matters involving federal campaign finance law. And finally, as I mentioned, my name is Erin Chlopak. I currently work with Saurav at Campaign Legal Center, and like Saurav and Meredith, my background in campaign finance law comes from my experience working at the Federal Election Commission, where I spent many years as a litigator, and before leaving the agency, ran the agency's policy division. So with that, let me just give you kind of a brief overview of how we're gonna proceed this morning. We're going to start with some background to provide some context for how and why secret money, which we often colloquially call dark money, is such a significant player in the United States political system. And we'll have a bit of a discussion, perhaps even a debate, about the nature and problems of undisclosed spending on our elections. And we'll also spend some time discussing solutions. And then we'll be sure to leave some time at the end for questions and comments from all of you. And with that, let's get started. So, Saurav, I'm hoping you can help us sort of set the scene for our conversation. I mentioned that United States law distinguishes between money given directly to a candidate and money spent independently to support or oppose a candidate, with the former category being subject to some fairly tight rules and the latter category being largely unregulated. So can you please explain the differences between these different categories and why our system treats them so differently?
Sure, I'd be happy to. Good morning, everyone. Thanks for coming out to hear about campaign finance bright and early today. So I'm going to give a little bit of background history on campaign finance and money in politics in the United States, being mindful of our audience maybe not being entirely aware of how it works here. For many decades, the campaign system in the United States, primarily at the federal level, has been financed privately. And a large reason why that's the case is because of sort of a seminal Supreme Court decision on the issue of the First Amendment and the way money is treated in the U.S. political system, and that's the Buckley decision, which essentially what is important to know from that decision and for its legacy is that the Supreme Court treated money as expression, money as speech, in terms of the First Amendment and the way in which money will be regulated. So one of the important elements of that decision is that it struck down expenditure limits, which the federal statute, the Federal Election Campaign Act, had imposed, and basically set us on a course towards steadily increasing private financing of campaigns in the United States. But I think the decision that everyone recognizes had the most monumental effect on the increase of money in our political system and why we are where we are today is, of course, the Citizens United decision in 2010. Now, that decision reversed many years of practice and precedent by permitting unlimited corporate independent expenditures. To break that phrase down a little bit, what it basically means is that an expenditure, which is money spent to influence a federal election, for many years corporations were not permitted to make expenditures in U.S. elections. So the corporations they are still not allowed to make contributions directly to candidates, but they were also not permitted to spend money trying to elect candidates from their general treasury. Citizens United changed that and permitted them to make independent expenditures, which, as Erin mentioned in the introduction, means that that spending can't be coordinated with candidates. But we can talk about the ways in which that too has become something of an illusion, because often the spending is coordinated with candidates. But just to round out the way in which we have so much money, a lower court decision following the Citizens United one said that now, since corporations and individuals can make unlimited independent expenditures, they can also give money to an organization formed solely to make independent expenditures. And that's what we commonly refer to as the super PAC. A super PAC is by definition allowed to take in as much money as it wants, as much corporate money as it wants, but conversely can only spend that money independently supporting candidates and campaigns. Again, not always in practice how it works out. But that has led to, over the past 12 years, an explosion of spending in our elections, amounts that simply keep growing every single election. We somehow seem to break the record every time with respect to the presidential cycle races like we're going to have in 2024, as well as the midterms, like the election we just had in November.
Thanks for that background, Saurav. So I'm familiar with the Citizens United decision, and my recollection is that there were two key sort of premises that were the basis of saying, it's fine, we don't have to worry about corruption if corporations start spending unlimited money on elections. And as you just noted, one of those is the idea that that money will be independent, that it's not coordinated with the candidates, that the money is spent to help or oppose. But the other piece of that was that the money would be transparent. I think there's even a line in the decision about we've never had a system before with all of this spending where it was all transparent and everybody knew what was going on so they could make decisions. So Beth, let me turn to you. Can you talk a little bit about First of all, is that what's actually happened as a result of the decision? Is all of this spending transparent? And why is transparency important? And feel free to reverse the order of those questions, if that makes sense.
Sure, thank you, and I'm happy to. So first off, there was, as Erin pointed out, this mistaken assumption that, I suppose because we live in an electronic age and we have the theoretical possibility to know a lot of things contemporaneously, that meant that this already existed. But the truth is, in most places, this doesn't exist, transparency of where the spending is. It does depend. And to add, transparency matters because for two main reasons. The idea is, one, that I think as many of you could resonate with, transparency is seen as the best disinfectant. There's a famous quote from one of the top judges to say that sunlight is in fact the best disinfectant. So there's of course the idea that if things are clear and transparent, then that's an important and key anti-corruption measure. But the other piece of it is that people have a right to make informed decisions. And the idea is, of course, that if there is transparency as to where the money is coming from and where it's going, a sort of a phrase that's popular in this world is if you can follow the money, then you can make more informed decisions. But the reality is that in many places, for reasons that I think some of you can imagine, opponents don't always want their opponents to know. Powerful people design these systems and can decide to underfund the regulatory piece that would require disclosure. So even if it's required, it's not always backed up with accountability. And while I did say, and we'll get to this more later, it depends, while transparency is not available at anything near that projected sort of utopian vision across the board, there are some states and cities in particular that do a much better job. So there is hope and there are models where it is working a lot better.
Thanks, Beth. Saurav, anything that you want to add to that?
Not much. I think Beth said it very well. I would just add that I think the idea of this panel in large part is to talk about the ways in which transparency had not only been something of an illusion already when Citizens United was decided, but has actually become more illusory over the 12 years since, as corporations have found new avenues of injecting secret spending, and even wealthy individuals who have particular interests in certain candidates and certain policies have found ways of not only spending in our elections, but spending in a way that's concealed from public view, which allows them to not only pursue their private agenda in government, in the policies that government makes, but to do so without the public being aware. And that's really why we're having this panel, and the ways in which that lack of transparency can, in fact, foster corruption.
Thanks for those explanations. So, I think it's important to acknowledge that our campaign finance rules in the U.S. Serve at least a couple of distinct purposes. And one that we've just been talking about is providing information to voters to detect violations and making sure that discouraging people from engaging in corrupt activities with the understanding that that will be disclosed. But on the flip side, there's also providing guidance to those who want to participate in the political process within the boundaries of the law, and so to have clarity on what those rules are. Meredith, as we talked about earlier, you have experience with both of those perspectives, first as an enforcement attorney at the Federal Election Commission, and now as an attorney in private practice advising clients who want to know what the rules are so that they can comply with them. Can you talk a little bit about the different perspectives that you have in looking at how the law applies to these different regulated people?
Sure, thank you, and thank you for having me. I think there is a very relevant debate to be had about the role of transparency in elections and how to best balance those interests against the First Amendment rights that the courts have recognized that individuals and organizations hold in the political process. But there's also the practical reality of the fact that we have a system where those rights have been recognized, and it has created a community of persons who are looking for information on how to exercise those rights within the bounds of the law. And I think as regulators, we tend to see the worst of the community. We see the bad actors because those are the groups against whom complaints are filed. Those are the groups attracting scrutiny in the media, and perhaps deservedly so, but we tend to see the bad actors. And in private practice, I have found that I came into it with a bit of cynicism, and that many people are looking to dodge the law and circumvent disclosure and avoid those obligations. But in reality, what I found is that a lot of organizations, most of my clients, are desperately looking to stay within the bounds of the law. They want to know where the line is and how to stay behind it. And the struggle they come up against is that the laws aren't very clear. Not in all jurisdictions, but in many jurisdictions, the laws aren't very clear. And so there's not a lot of understanding, or it's very difficult to understand how your goals and your plans may fit into the compliance requirements. And so, and the reasons that organizations may want to be compliant range. In the US, we do have a system of criminal and civil penalties for violations of the campaign finance laws, but there are also laws that can result in a loss of business if a corporation makes contributions to candidates that might control public contracts that the business has. So you can lose business by violating campaign finance laws. If you are a publicly traded company, you may face backlash from your shareholders if you are in a non-compliant position, or increasingly, even if you're not a publicly traded company, there may be backlash among your employees, and so compliance can also be an important interest there. And then finally, and I think this is the biggest one, is reputational damage. For every bad actor that is looking to get away with something, I'm finding there are many, many more actors that are very concerned about reputational damage if they are viewed as trying to circumvent the law or get away with something, or even do something within the bounds that is perceived as shady or nefarious in some way. And so I think there are a lot of interests in the private community about how to comply with the laws, and they have to do so against a backdrop of laws that aren't always very clear.
Thanks, and we will come back to that a little bit later, talking about what solutions that may already be proposed, or what our expert panel would propose to address both these transparency gaps and the lack of clarity in the law. But before we do that, I wanted to come back to an issue that we were talking about a few minutes ago, which is that in the Citizens United decision, there was this, fundamental idea that there wouldn't be any concerns about corruption because all of this spending would be transparent. And Beth told us a little bit about how that's not actually always the case. And Saurav, I was hoping you could talk a bit more about why that's the case. Why is dark money a thing in our political system if our laws require political spending to be transparent?
Of course. So the phrase dark money gets used quite a bit in terms of talking about the way money impacts our elections. So let's at least define how it is and what it works. I think the most common form of dark money that we see is spending through tax-exempt corporations that claim tax exemption under sections of the tax code, typically 501c4, which is reserved for, quote, social welfare organizations, or in some cases 501c6s. Basically what you need to know is that these are corporations that exist and claim to further a social welfare function. So they claim that they are advocating on issues that are important to society. So you might have an organization that is dedicated to promoting gun rights or promoting abortion rights or the opposite, just to give an example. So these organizations that's what they generally claim is their purpose. But the important caveat is that they are also permitted under federal tax law to engage in political spending. They can have a portion of their activity that's dedicated to political activity without losing their tax-exempt status. And that is one of those loopholes that has, in theory, sounds like it's just a portion of their activity. But I think the reality that we see every election cycle is that these organizations actually spend a tremendous amount of money directly influencing our elections. And because of their status as nonprofits rather than political committees, these organizations do not disclose their donors. So the law, campaign finance law, requires that any political committee, any candidate's campaign has to disclose the names of all of its donors and identifying information about who those people are, because, as Beth said earlier, it's fundamental to our election system that voters know not only where the candidates stand and their issues, but also who is spending money to help get them elected or to oppose other candidates, so that when they go to vote, when they cast their ballot, they do so meaningfully participating in the process, well informed about who's actually behind the candidates. But with these nonprofit organizations, there's no such donor disclosure required. So as a result, when these organizations either directly spend money on election ads saying, vote for Meredith McCoy or don't vote for Beth Rotman, that spending is disclosed, but who actually provided the funding to the nonprofit organization to finance that isn't disclosed. And another common way in which they do it in more recent election cycles is they don't even spend the money directly. They give the money to a super PAC that is already making those kinds of ads. And the super PAC discloses the money coming from the nonprofit, but the nonprofit doesn't have to disclose its donors. So the ultimate source of the funding is kept concealed by this entire ecosystem, which is grounded, as I said, on a seemingly innocent caveat built into tax law that unfortunately is being exploited for millions and even hundreds of millions of dollars in election spending.
Thanks, Saurav. And this isn't just an abstract issue. We see it play out where there are individuals that may be a single individual may be the source of a ton of money that ends up getting funneled through an organization. So I was wondering, Saurav, are there any stories or examples that you think are worth sharing with the group to kind of illustrate how this plays out?
Sure. I mean, there's really no end to the ways in which this is done. There are often partner 501c4s that partner with a super PAC, and in fact, there was a case some years ago where there were news reports that, I'm forgetting the name of the gentleman, but he approached donors to his sort of umbrella of organizations and said, well, if you want to support, this was in 2016, so it was for President Trump, if you want to support Trump, openly you can give to the super PAC, but if you want to be a non-disclosed donor, you can actually give to the C4 group. And with the understanding that, of course, the C4 group would in turn be making a large donation to the super PAC. So I think that example kind of illustrates the appeal, the fundraising pitch that the people who organize this system are making to donors, that you don't necessarily, you may have read that the law requires donors to be disclosed, but actually we've set it up so that you don't necessarily have to be disclosed, and here's how it can be done.
Beth, I was hoping you can talk a little bit about how this plays out at the state level.
Sure. Well, it really depends on the state. I will say that one of the best things that can happen is that because we have a system in the United States of federal, state, and local elections, is that states and municipalities can pass things that are much, much better than what we see on the federal level, and sometimes they do. And I will say that there is a saying that I'm sure plays into what some of you deal with in your own work, which is never waste a good scandal. So because of some scandals, some very progressive and important pro-democratic programs exist in the United States that are available and thriving in some of the states and cities. I've been lucky to be part of a few of them, in Connecticut and now in New York City, where and sometimes these are passed by ballot measures where people get together and vote on these on a ballot, and sometimes the legislature actually passed them themselves, like in Connecticut. And that's after really sweeping corruption scandals. People realize there has to be a change. And so one of the things that can happen is a system of what's called publicly financed elections can be passed. And what that means, some people call them small donor democracy, but the big benefit for the public is essentially that there is the opportunity for everyday people to give small contributions, which don't always have much value if you're in a monetary arms race like we see at the federal level. But in states and cities where we have these public financing programs like Connecticut or New York City, candidates can give small amounts of money and then collect small amounts of money from members of the public to show that they're serious candidates. There's usually a threshold to meet, and then a large amount of the money will come from the public fund. And the reason that this is helpful would be a couple of things. First off, you've cut down on some of the arms race. You've given actual real people an opportunity to give small amounts of money, and then what you see in New York City is a match. So if you give $5, then 8 times that will be given by the city. So your contribution has much, much, much more value. And then additionally, and I think most critically to some of what we've been hearing, there's real accountability. Because these programs exist, because of a sort of broken public trust, when these programs are passed, you have an obligation to the public to say, all right, this is a program that is about restoring public trust, which means that we don't just give out public money. We actually also pass additional rules, additional transparency rules, additional oversight rules, and we get these programs funded to actually be able to check. So some of the things that are huge problems in the private system become very well handled, or handled to very large extents in these public financing programs, at least to the extent that there is a lot more accountability. You get a lot more auditors and transparency because you're saying we're giving out public money. So there are more than, it used to be only a handful. Now there's more than a handful of these programs across the country. New York City, where I'm at now, the program passed 30 years ago and has been improved over time. Anyway, we can talk more about that later, but these small donor public financing programs are seen as a gold standard in the U.S., and we're seeing more and more of them.
Thanks. And yes, we'll definitely come back to talking about solutions that we see, like public financing and other solutions at the federal level. But first, I wanted to turn back to Saurav. You know, we talked about different rules that we have in our campaign finance system, and we've been talking about how they're exploited. And one of the rules that I think we touched on is, and it's certainly relevant to this conference, is that the United States federal law prohibits foreign nationals from spending money to influence elections, not only at the federal level, but also at the state and local level. And one of the real consequences of these loopholes that we have in terms of transparency is that they provide an opportunity for exploitation by foreign nationals in violation of those rules. And Saurav, I was hoping you could talk a little bit about that.
Sure, I'm happy to. I think probably the best recent example of dark money facilitating foreign national influence in the U.S. elections has to do with a little company called Global Energy Producers, or GEP. The names associated with that are perhaps a bit more familiar. GEP was formed by Lev Parnas and Igor Fruman, two Ukrainian Americans who essentially set up GEP under the premise that it was going to be prospecting in natural gas. And so with a name like Global Energy Producers, that was their claim for why this company existed. But according to the indictment by the Justice Department, and just to spoil the ending for everyone, both Mr. Parnas and Fruman were convicted and I believe both have now been sentenced to prison terms. But according to the DOJ indictment, GEP was a front and never really conducted any business, but was in fact used by the two men to facilitate various contributions, some of which included money from a foreign national, a Ukrainian billionaire whose name is now going to escape me. But the whole idea is that their purpose behind creating this company, using it to make political contributions, including money that is explicitly forbidden from being used to influence elections, that is any money from a foreign national. Their whole purpose was to advance the policy and electoral goals of the individuals providing the money to them. So I think the fact that they used this innocuous sounding company to make the contributions really illustrates the problem. The contribution as disclosed to the public on various disclosure reports didn't say the name of the foreign billionaire, and it didn't say Igor Fruman or Lev Parnas. It said Global Energy Producers, LLC. And only after a robust investigation of that entire scheme was the Justice Department able to gather enough evidence to indict the two men and ultimately to obtain convictions. And the hope, of course, is that their fate will serve as kind of a deterrent for future individuals that are considering the same action. But I think the reality, of course, is that you don't enter a scheme like that thinking of the consequences. You, generally speaking, are expecting you won't get caught. So that's far, and I say that because that's far from the only example, but it's a very recent one that I think demonstrates exactly how the system of dark money works at its absolute worst.
Thanks. So, I want to talk about whether we've talked a lot about bad actors and sort of exploiting loopholes, but Meredith, I was wondering if you can talk a bit about whether, this is always the case. You mentioned earlier lack of clarity in the rules. So are there other reasons why, undisclosed money ends up in our elections? What's your experience?
Yeah, so I think one thing that I would add to the excellent summary that Saurav has given is that, these 501c4 groups in particular are not always fly-by-night operations, which you may have gotten the impression from Saurav's telling. The U.S. tax code permits organizations to form for the purpose of influencing social welfare. And they are sort of a counterpoint to American public charities. Public charities are not permitted to engage in unlimited amounts of lobbying. They are not permitted to engage in any political activity, meaning they aren't allowed to support or oppose candidates in any form. And so the tax code has created an alternate vehicle, the 501c4, through which organizations focused on bettering aspects of society can engage in lobbying and, to a limited extent, participate in U.S. elections. And this is a condition of their tax status. So there are very well-known, very well-established organizations that you would recognize that are, in fact, 501c4s. The American Civil Liberties Union is a 501c4. There are groups formed to promote, gun violence prevention, or to even advocate for campaign finance reform. And they are all formed under 501c4 of the tax code. And their activities include things like advocating for new laws that to incorporate change and better society, however the group defines that. So these organizations engage in a wide variety of activities, some of which include influencing elections. And some C4s don't even do that. So the point is that these organizations, some may be formed as a method of circumvention, but many are formed for legitimate social welfare purposes. And so what happens is that a donor may give to one of these organizations because they say, I support your mission. I support your efforts to reduce gun violence. And so however you achieve that mission, I want to show my support by giving to you. And so they give not because they necessarily want to fund a particular advertisement saying vote for or vote against somebody, but because they say gun violence is important to me, preventing gun violence is important to me, and so I'm going to support this organization that is out there doing good work to create change. Now, then the C4 may say, independently of their conversations with a donor, I think the way that we can advance our mission, one of the ways that we can advance our mission is to elect candidates who are likely to adopt those policies. And so they may use the limited amount of their budget that they can to support or oppose candidates to do so. They may make contributions to candidates where it's permitted, or they may, spend directly. And the donor may know about that. They may not know about that. And so, but that donor's money may, in effect, fund the electoral activities. And so, in that way, a donor may end up being disclosed if a state law requires it or a federal law requires it, or they may not. And so there are far less nefarious reasons why a donor might not be disclosed. And I think there's some real practical challenges as well, because one thing I grapple with on almost a daily basis is the fact that a lot of these laws, what they say is, well, you need to disclose donors if they have given for the purpose of influencing an election. And my clients will say to me, well, how should I know if what this donor's intent is? And how do I make those decisions? And some laws are very clear. They provide criteria that a C4 can say, well, yes, this money was given in response to a solicitation that mentioned our electoral work. So therefore, that donation is given for the purpose of influencing an election. But a donor may have just read in the news that such and such C4 is doing electoral work and said, hey, I want to support that. In that situation, the donor's intent is explicitly to support the electoral activity, but the C4 might not know that. They don't know that why the donor has come to them. They're just happy to have the support. And so you run into practical compliance challenges where laws may either be over-inclusive in that they, try to sweep in all donors, whether or not their intent was to support or oppose candidates, And they may be under-inclusive because they may not be able to capture a donor's intent because it's not known to the C4. And so it's really, and I say this not to necessarily elicit sympathy for C4s. If we decide transparency is paramount, then we pass laws with more details that elicit the disclosure we want. But I say it to illustrate the complexity of the system, which is that when lawmakers pass these laws, they have to create a system that accommodates that plans for the bad actors and how to detect and enforce the law against them, but also, creates a system that can be complied with and that, is understood and that allows these organizations to engage in activity that they are legitimately entitled to participate in.
Saurav, I see you ready to respond, so go ahead.
No, I was just hoping to make this a little more interactive, rather than each of us kind of giving a speech. I think Meredith is absolutely right. Part of the problem is that as somebody who spent 7 years in the enforcement side, working at the FEC, and now what I do at Campaign Legal Center is still try and find the bad actors. It's clear that my perspective is who is trying to use loopholes, exploit the system to advance their goals. Meredith's day-to-day, I'm sure, involves a lot more of the other side, which is folks trying to comply with the law. So and this is why I think our two perspectives are really valuable, because we're talking about the same system, but very different actors within it. The one thing I'll say is that Meredith mentioned earlier clarity being something her clients want. And actually within I think both the regulatory community as well as the advocacy community, clarity is a goal that we support as well. I think that's no one is out there supporting, advocating for laws that are confusing and are difficult to follow. And I agree that over time, the law can become confusing. I think the goal here, if we share the goal of laws that are clear, I think the one caveat from our perspective, our end of things, is that the clarity should also require more transparency than less, because the issue of corruption, the issue of allowing voters to have all the information they need to participate in the system, I think that it's not mutually exclusive with the goal of allowing C4 organizations to spend some money on their political activity if that's how they choose to advance their organization's goals. The problem is when they are advancing their organization's goals and wittingly or unwittingly are in fact being used as a vehicle for someone else to engage in election influence that the public doesn't know about. And I think disclosure, clearly requiring disclosure of those individuals' contributions to C4 organizations, I think would serve both purposes.
I was just going to add that, I think the other piece that adds, I think, some of the reality to this discussion is also that I'm a regulator now in New York City who also runs a good government program. Because the good government program gives away public money in exchange for a lot of requirements, we also get to do more regulating. But every time that someone like me, of course, would testify, and this is about election law, so every single person, to kind of clarify things, make things maybe stronger. The reality is that every single person that I'm bargaining with that is in the elected body is an expert in election law because they run for office. Sometimes, there was one hearing about something that I thought were relatively simple, clarifying regulatory changes. I was there for 7 hours. And so, I think that one of the challenges is that to making things stronger, more transparent, clearer, that we do a better job with in some of the states and localities that have these sort of gold standard programs, because we get more resources and because there's public money involved, we maybe have additional accountability is that we are talking about election laws here, which means that we have a very, very, very interested body of everybody being an expert because they run for office. It is about them. And sometimes you need a psychologist to understand why election laws that are negotiated with the federal, state, or local sort of oversight, I'm sorry, not the oversight agency, but the actual elected officials. And I believe, I'm not a cynical person, I believe many, many people are running for office for all the right reasons, which is why I'm in this field. But as a regulator, I can say, as somebody who's charged with moving forward to better clarify the rules that we oversee, both I've done this at the state level and the city level, many, many times when you say, let's make this clear, the answer is no. That is not the answer people want, right? And let's make this clear, these are the only 6 ways you can do this. That goes over like a lead balloon. So yes, there is a desire for sort of clarity and sort of more transparency in sometimes, but sometimes it's not. And I'm not saying there aren't good reasons for that, but I mean, I think it's important to keep in mind sort of what the challenge is here, which is that every single person who runs for office becomes, in their own mind, an expert in these laws, and we have to bargain with them. They have to pass these changes. And even if they don't pass the changes because they are passed on what's called a ballot measure, where some things can pass by a popular vote of residents, they have the ability to change them once they're in office. And it's very personal, and sometimes you need a psychologist to understand some of the changes made, at the state or local level, because it's about something that they didn't like that their opponent did. So I just want to share that, that there's that challenge in election law in the U.S. as well.
Thanks. I want to move on soon to talk about solutions, but before we do, I think, an important feature of the U.S. campaign finance system is the way that it is enforced. And so we have civil enforcement and criminal enforcement. But on the civil side, there's an entity, which you've heard a little bit about because 3 of us have backgrounds there, called the Federal Election Commission, which is an independent agency that is the sole entity responsible for interpreting and enforcing campaign finance law. And when we talk about the importance of clarity in our laws, it's not just how they're written and having rules that address all of the situations that arise and those rules being clear, but it's also clarity in how they're enforced. And a very recent example comes to mind, which is just last week, the FEC, after waiting nearly over a decade to pass rules addressing political spending online, finally passed a rule, and within hours of the rule being passed, 2 of the commissioners that voted in favor of it issued what they called an interpretive statement that I read to essentially say, by the way, we're not going to actually enforce these in certain circumstances where we don't think they should be. And so I think, Saurav, I was hoping maybe you can talk a little bit about how the role of the agency responsible for interpreting and enforcing the laws contributes to the lack of clarity that we see, and how that presents an obstacle to, even when we have clear rules, the regulated community and others understanding how they're going to be enforced.
Of course. The Federal Election Commission, if you've ever heard of it before today, read about it in the press, the agency is usually accompanied by the word dysfunction somewhere in the article or the report. And I think that's probably appropriate given their track record of the past decade or so. The agency has sharply divided views among the 6 commissioners. And those are not differences in terms of nuances of the law or occasional differences in whether someone has violated the law. The differences are really stark differences of opinion on what the law should be, and really even what the agency's mission ought to be. So what the result for the regulated community, both good actors and bad, is that the laws, whether they are clear or not, are very seldom enforced. And frankly, the laws themselves are not updated in any kind of reasonable manner. As Erin just mentioned, the FEC's updated rule for online political spending was updated. The process began in 2011, and as everyone in this room knows, the term online spending or online ads doesn't mean today what it meant in 2011. So this update that they made to the regulation has actually been sorely needed for years, and even when they finally delivered it, it wasn't. It was immediately made unclear as to exactly what at least two of them meant by supporting this initiative and whether they will actually enforce it. So there's really too many examples of this dysfunction to go into, but I think it's important to know at a sort of an overall level that when we're talking about ambiguities or lack of clarity in the law, it's not just the law as written, but as actually implemented by the federal agency responsible for doing that.
Meredith, go ahead and respond.
Yeah, and I'll just add that while I found the rulemaking interesting because I enjoy the nuances of political law, in the regulated community, it kind of went over as a big nothing. Because the regulated community, in the vacuum of clear rules about how to include disclaimers on their online digital ads, had come up with a compliance system that, people were, what the standard had been was that you need to tell the world who has paid for this ad in a way that is clear and conspicuous, which was terribly unhelpful when you're on the phone with a digital content creator who says, well, what size font does that mean? Or how long does it have to be on screen? And you say, it's a gut feeling, and it was a very subjective standard. And so over time, the community participating in elections came up with standards, and the industry that sells advertising came up with their own standards. And so the rules that were adopted last week didn't really change the status quo. They really recognized a lot of what organizations were already doing. They added a little bit more clarity about how long things have to be on screen, and I think my clients will appreciate that. But I say this not to be dismissive of the agency, for which I have a lot of respect, and especially for the people who work there, but I think it just goes to show that when a regulator is not able to keep up with the pace of change in elections, the regulated community will regulate itself, and it may not always be in a way that is satisfying. And so, it just shows that the importance of, making the efforts to push the change and negotiate with the lawmakers and those sorts of things.
Thanks. So I want to talk now for a little bit about solutions. We have covered a variety of problems with our system and transparency today. We talked about how a lack of transparency of spending, of the sources of spending on our elections, deprives voters of information that they need to meaningfully participate in our political process. It creates opportunities for bad actors and foreign sources to try to spend money to influence our elections, opportunities for corruption, evasion of other rules like contribution limits. And we also talked about how the lack of clarity makes it difficult for folks who want to follow the rules to be able to do so. So I was hoping each of our panelists can talk a little bit about solutions, whether we're talking about solutions that have been proposed at the state level or in the federal level, and to the extent they haven't been proposed, what would your ideal system look like? So Meredith, I'll start with you.
I think I personally have a take on what I think the ideal system looks like, but I think as a practitioner, my concern is mostly that we put forward standards that are more detailed rather than less detailed. I understand the challenge from a lawmaking perspective, that broad laws are often more flexible laws, and they are capable of being applied to various situations. And I think the disclaimer rulemaking this week is a good example of that, because the idea is that we'll say disclaimers are required on all digital advertising, but 20 years from now, digital advertising is going to mean something different from what it does today. And so a broad law is intended to evolve, but it doesn't provide practical standards. And so I think in the states where I think that have been very successful in creating a compliance environment that balances the interests of transparency against the need to know how to comply with the law are systems where perhaps the statute is quite broad, but the regulatory body is empowered to put forward regulations implementing those statutes that lend more flexibility and can be adapted more easily to changing norms and standards and practices, and to empower regulators to issue just informal guidance that really that really provides clear answers. A lot of what I talk to clients about is risk tolerance, and if I can get clear guidance from a regulator about how they expect to enforce the law or practices, or can point me in the direction of a recent enforcement action that might be instructive, that's really empowering, and I can provide my clients with clearer answers. And so to me, the ideal system balances flexibility and adaptability against empowering regulators to provide clearer guidance and respond to changing needs.
Saurav?
I actually agree with that entirely. I think no matter how well written a statute or a regulation is, it's going to leave some things out, particularly as with the passage of time, the meaning of terms do change. So the gap that is formed there should be filled by a regulator that is interpreting the law in particular cases, and that can serve to both police bad actors and guide good actors, if we're dividing the world into this black and white view. I think the idea is that if you have an enforcement decision against someone who is clearly trying to avoid disclosure, avoid transparency in their election influence, and you have a clear consensus from the regulator that that's what's happening, that can inform the regulated community, and I think that's the great system. Now, in the absence of that, since as I mentioned, the Federal Election Commission very often doesn't serve that role, one of the solutions that Congress could enact that would be tremendously helpful in providing clarity to everyone who wants to engage in election spending, as well as providing transparency to voters about who is spending on candidates. And that's a federal bill called the Disclose Act, which has been around for several congressional cycles and unfortunately consistently gets stonewalled in Congress by people who mischaracterize its provisions and its underlying purpose as somehow undermining the First Amendment rights of individuals to speak on political issues. I think, as I'm making patently clear, I think that's a gross mischaracterization of what the Disclose Act would do. Essentially, it goes right at the problem that we've been talking about today, that these 501c4 dark money groups, sorry, Meredith, I shouldn't call them dark money groups in general. They're not all dark money groups, but 501c4 groups, the ones that are there to actually advance social welfare, as well as those that are being misused to influence elections in secret, they would have to disclose the donors that give $10,000 or more to be spent on political activity. And importantly, if a donor doesn't want to be disclosed and doesn't want to, by the same token, doesn't want to influence elections, they can make that clear at the time they give their money to the C4 group. It also includes provisions that require tracing back any money that's spent on political activity to the original source. So if money is sort of funneled through a GEP like Mr. Parnas and Fruman did, GEP would be required to disclose where the money originally came from. I think the fact that that is characterized as somehow curtailing or infringing on the First Amendment, I remember at the congressional hearing for the Disclose Act in the last Congress, Ted Cruz took the mic and basically started grandstanding about how he couldn't believe how many senators were fundamentally opposed to the First Amendment. I mean, that sort of rhetoric is clearly unhelpful when I think both the regulated community and the regulators agree on the need for greater clarity and hopefully greater transparency to advance the goals of the election system.
Yeah, I mean, I'll add to that I think one of the things that bears saying here is that, we're in Washington, and many of the oversight structures like the Federal Election Commission that are often called, for example, the FEC is often called dysfunctional, but why? It's not that, they're amazing people that work there. Everyone here they work there. It's not the people, it's the structure. And why is the structure that way? A big part of why the structure is that way is because they are an agency that is set up to potentially levy huge penalties against powerful people. So the ideal structure, and so that is why there's a lot of bouncing of heads where one side won't agree to levy a penalty here, the other side won't here, and things are stuck. And it also prevents people being nimble in these roles. Even though they're wonderful people that work there, they can, I'm sure, come up with many of the best alternatives to what we have now. But if you can't get it through the commission, the top, they're the ones that sit sort of like the judges and the decision makers, then you can't do anything. And you still have rules that talk about fax machines in a digital age. So I've been very fortunate to give a counterexample to that of, I think, what is one of the best examples of an agency with a very long arc of progress and change, and it's why I wanted this role at the New York City Campaign Finance Board. After sweeping scandals over 30 years ago, laws were passed. Those laws do not look very similar to a lot of what I'm charged with overseeing now. And part of that is because we have a 5-member board, no more than 2 members from any political party, and they have enabled a tremendous staff to be very nimble, to do our oversight job really well, and to work together with the lawmakers in New York City to make phenomenal changes over the years, so that what was passed 30 years ago has been so dramatically improved. It's almost, it was, those beginning parts are still there, but there is so much more. For example, we also have the mandate of making sure that the 8 million people in New York City know when, where, and how to vote, because we're also a democracy sort of shop together with being a better regulatory system and a better way of financing elections. So another quick example is when Mayor Bloomberg spent $100 million in elections to run for mayor. A lot of people got together and said, all right, we can't make it so that people running, he did not use the program, and he challenged the program by spending so much money. You have wealthy people who run for office who don't elect to join these are voluntary programs because of all of the constitutional cases that our friends spoke about earlier. But when that happened, a lot of people got together and said, all right, maybe we need to give more money to encourage, not $100 million, but we need to make some changes. And one of the biggest changes that came about was that the law was changed. I got to work on this my first time there to make disclosure a requirement for everybody who was not in the program. So yes, Bloomberg wasn't going to use the small donor democracy program, but every penny of his $100 million had to be disclosed, and it was searchable, and it was transparent. And it's an example of something on the city level doing something much, much stronger, and that's only because we are able to be nimble and change over time.
Thanks, Beth. So I wanted to quickly note, I was remiss in failing to introduce my colleague, Sophie Gonzalez-Brown, who's at the end of the table, who is here to help facilitate keeping notes and will help with the report of this presentation today, but also is here to help gather questions from you. So now is the opportunity for audience questions or comments. So I invite any of you to please let us know what questions you have for us.
Hi. Thank you for coming today. Jack Anderson, U.S. Department of State. I think it was after the Citizens United decision, there was a lot, that I had heard about in the press that corporations were considered to be individuals. And I was wondering if you thought that that was a proper characterization, and if so, why was it characterized that way?
Well, I think Mitt Romney famously made that statement, and I would say that the idea behind it is that in that decision, and in at least the way corporations have been treated under campaign finance rules, is that they have the speech rights of individuals if you're characterizing spending on elections as equivalent to speech. As I mentioned, the Supreme Court has used that viewpoint to inform its jurisprudence for many decades. I think fundamentally that's only one side of the First Amendment, and I think the basic idea of empowering political expression to create a vibrant, informed electorate that's meaningfully participating in elections, I think if that's your view of why the First Amendment exists and the underlying goals that it has, then saying that corporations are people is a bit misleading, because corporations can, of course, spend unlimited amounts of money on elections, but they don't vote. They don't actually inform who gets elected at the ballot box. So it's really just one side of I would call it a very blinkered view of what the First Amendment does, what it protects, and why it exists. But if you take that view, then I suppose you'd agree with that.
My name is Erida Skandai. I am from the Albanian Helsinki Committee. My question is about civil society engagement in the United States for exposing dark money. How active are the organizations here, and which are the tools that they use for such exposure? Thank you.
Saurav, I think you're the right person to answer that question as the representative of campaign.
So when you talk about civil society, are you talking about sort of nonprofit groups? Okay, so Erin and I both work for an organization called Campaign Legal Center, which is an organization broadly dedicated to advancing democratic goals through legal processes, including investigating potential violations of campaign finance law, as well as where the law could be stronger, where it's currently being exploited. And we've talked about a little bit of both sides of that today. Our community is actually very robust and vibrant, and we often partner with other organizations that are obviously pursuing the same goals in trying to strengthen the law, advocate for legislative and regulatory reforms, and to have the law enforced in cases where we believe it's broken. So, if the question is, are we active and do we sort of try to improve things? Absolutely.
Beth, did you want to talk about that from your perspective at Common Cause?
Yeah, sure. I think that one of the key things and I was part of a large organization called Common Cause. I was in that role for 3 years as the National Director of Money and Politics and Ethics. It was my one time working outside of the government in a more civil society organization, a nonprofit. And one of the things that we did and do, and groups like Common Cause do, that is really critical, is we try to connect the kinds of issues we're talking about here to people's everyday lives and kitchen table issues, and try to develop active supporters around the country who are people, real people, who will get engaged and make the phone calls, send the texts, go to the city hall, state hall, national, and be what really we call a citizen lobby. And that's a really, really important part of civic engagement in America, that there are organizations like the Campaign Legal Center, like Common Cause, that work together with, for example, including organizations now, as I'm part of the government and what's called a watchdog agency, but when you want to sort of make something better, you want to work in coalition in America with the regulatory agency that understands some of the challenges with the law and the sort of groups that are dedicated to connecting real people to these challenges.
And if I may just take a point of moderator's privilege, I think the nature of the work we do, I think, is integral in exposing some of the stories that you've heard today. The group that Saurav leads at CLC, and I see a former colleague in the audience, Brendan Fisher, who formerly led it, has done tremendous work in working with reporters and just doing our own digging and exposing some of these scandals and bringing them to the attention of the public, both through communicating with the press, through complaints that we filed with the FEC. We also do work putting pressure on agencies like the FEC by exposing dysfunction and challenging them, sometimes in court. But obviously, we have limited resources, and these, some of the people we're talking about have unlimited resources. So it's certainly a challenge.
And if I can just add from my
there's
perspective,
Meredith, go ahead.
I think that's a really important point. When we talk to clients about risk tolerance and whether to go forward with a particular action, as I said before, a huge consideration is reputational damage. And so the free press and the work that civil society organizations do to push that information in the press has a real deterrent effect on activity that might be on the riskier edge of things. And so I think, it's, I think what's really interesting about our system is that anybody can bring a complaint. And so any person can file a complaint with the Federal Election Commission, and it's the same way in most of the states. And so it's empowering the citizens. It's responding to the press. It's pushing these stories out into the press so that someone does file a complaint. And so I think, and from our perspective, clients are very, very motivated by just public discussion and reputational considerations and the cost of defending these enforcement actions. And so I think it's, from my perspective, the work that those organizations do is very, it looms large.
Good morning. My name is Juan Mackay. I'm from Panama. We have a combination of private and public sponsoring of the candidates. Yeah, we have a problem, which is probably in the United States, it's not just recognized. The darker than darker money, the darker money over the shadow, because there's mostly in the local areas, there are candidates that buy construction materials, and the factory probably gives it to them. It is not declared. They don't need to declare it, because this local candidate, when he becomes senator, mayor, or whatever, is going to go back and assign the bid to buy the material from that company. So that company probably works 2-3 hours a night, and they supply all the materials. It doesn't need to be deducted, it doesn't need to be declared. And I'm sure it's not happening only in Panama. It happens everywhere in the world, including the United States. How, if you have any idea, how to control it?
Go ahead, Meredith.
I'd be happy to talk about it. In certain jurisdictions in the U.S., we have what are called pay-to-play laws. And these laws basically say, they typically impose contribution restrictions on companies that have public contracts, or if you have made contributions in the past, you have to disclose that when you submit your bid for a public contract. And so it is both. There are bans on contributions, and there's transparency elements that try to bring potential corruption into the daylight. And these laws are not universal. There are jurisdictions that are more aggressive about them, but they are effective. New Jersey is a state that has very effective pay-to-play laws, and they apply to not only contributions from the company itself, but from its principals. So its executives, its board of directors, their spouses, their dependent children. And if you violate these laws, your company can be barred from obtaining a contract for a period of years, or they may be barred from, or they may lose existing contracts. And so the consequences can be quite significant. And so this is a law, these are laws that we see in certain jurisdictions. The local jurisdictions are actually very active in imposing these laws, more so than at the state or the federal level. And so that's one way that we see this type of activity being deterred.
Can I also offer, since Meredith is offering a perspective on where the laws are robust and working well to deter this activity, let me tell a quick story that our CLC colleague Brendan Fisher will also find very familiar. There was a political contribution to a super PAC of $150,000 that came from a company, an LLC in Hawaii, that had a very obscure name and very little record of what it did or what it was even formed for. And some investigative work by a local journalist, as well as a complaint filed by our organization, eventually uncovered that that organization, the limited liability company, was actually formed and financed by a company that was federal contractor. They had, Defense Department contracts, and the super PAC they supported actually was a primary supporter of a senator who is pivotal in them obtaining and continuing to obtain those Defense Department contracts. And the reason why they set up this LLC to make the contribution in a way using that dark money system was to conceal the fact that the contractor was the one actually providing that money. And so I think it's great that we have these laws. It's great that we, in theory, recognize the corruption of a pay-to-play type transaction. But we still need to be vigilant because, of course, dark money, lack of transparency can partner with that corruption concern. And only through investigative work and civil society work are we able to police that.
I'll just add one note, which is that in the program that I built for the state of Connecticut, it came about, like I said, you never waste a good scandal. And it was a massive pay-to-play, worse. It was actually bribery. And the governor went to jail, but essentially he was not paying contractors to do tremendous amounts of work on his home. And he did eventually go to jail for this. But one of the things that led to reform, including a complete ban on contributions to campaigns from people who are principals of contractors or people seeking contracts, one of the reasons that is a reform that's part of campaign finance law is the idea, as you pointed out so well, that these relationships very often start on the campaign trail. And so many things that are or not illegal, like bribery is already a crime. In certain ways, he already crossed the criminal standard. But what I do in my regulatory space is it's not, yes, we hopefully catch those really extreme examples that send people to jail. But we also essentially have to sell reform that is not just that is not just a crime when people go to jail, particularly because we're selling it oftentimes to politicians that need to pass it. And so one of the points that we try to make, and I think it's something that I'm sure could have thought about, is, look, if that's what people think about politicians, if that's what they think, then the best way for them not to think that is to have transparency and rules against that kind of pay-to-play, so that you're collecting your money from actual people that you might want to represent, and that those actual people then believe they have more of a stake in your government. And I say that because it's important to go, in my space, beyond what is sort of the worst, even though we get the laws that way, because most of the time we're not talking about, you know, Governor Rowland who wasn't paying for jacuzzis on his home and then giving out those contracts. But the Governor Rowland who didn't pay for the jacuzzi got the nuns in the state of Connecticut, because that's how broad the civil society coalition was, to go around the state, make people care about who owns their government, and pass a ban, which then was challenged, but survived. So, and then it has to be enforced. It has to be explained, it has to be enforced. So that's the Connecticut experience on that, and the big scandal was exactly pay to play.
I think we have time for one more question, if there are any more.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Badji Koulibaly. I'm from Mali. So I work by the side of the National Anti-Corruption Agency. Thanks a lot for your brilliant presentation. So it helps us to discover many things as far as campaigns are concerned in terms of elections, and as far as bad actors are concerned. Okay, so if my memory stuck well, the gentleman keep on talking about Super PAC. Would you mind giving me more details about that issue? Thanks.
Sure. The topic of super PACs is quite broad, but basically they are political committees that are formed to raise money from unlimited amounts of money from individuals, and can also take money from corporations. And their function in theory was, I guess, twofold. One, that they can only make independent expenditures, meaning they cannot coordinate their activity with candidates. And the second component is that they are required to fully disclose all of the money that they take in and all of the money that they spend. Those were the two basic premises on which the Supreme Court said, and the lower court following the Supreme Court said, that these political committees can exist and can take unlimited amounts of money from individuals and corporations. Unfortunately, the American experience has been that both prongs of the Supreme Court's analysis have proven false in practice. On the coordination side, we see that super PACs and candidates use clever tricks to coordinate their activities. One of those tricks, just as an example, is that candidates will often feature on their website a section that says voters need to know and read, particularly if they're white males over the age of 50, that candidate Saurav Ghosh is pro-guns or something like that. And that will be on their website alongside all the other pictures of candidate Ghosh shaking hands and cheering in front of a factory. The point is that message was intended and is intended for super PACs to read and then make their ads accordingly, make their election spending align with that message. That's the kind of coordination that is prohibited, but because it's happening on a public website, the FEC has taken the position that that is permitted, and frankly, it grossly undermines the coordination ban, the idea that these groups are independent. And just briefly on the disclosure side, unfortunately, as I talked about earlier, unfortunately, what folks often do to avoid the true source of the money to the super PAC being disclosed is that they will funnel it through some sort of intermediary. That can be a limited liability company or some other business entity. And so the super PAC will only disclose a contribution from that entity and not from the billionaire that actually gave money to that entity. Or the super PAC will report that they received a large contribution from a 501c4 social welfare group, whereas that social welfare group never discloses that it got virtually all of its money from 2 or 3 very wealthy individuals. And so that disclosure piece is also a complete fiction in practice. That's basically the nuts and bolts of super PACs.
And if I may just suggest, please feel free to talk to us after this panel, and we'd be happy to share contact information. And I'm sure Saurav could spend hours talking your ear off about super PACs, and we'd be happy to provide you more information if you're interested. I see one more question. I think perhaps we can squeeze in one more, but I think we are getting close to the end of our session. I think in the back there.
Thanks a lot for the opportunity. My name is Jorge Valladares. I work at the Transparency International Secretariat. I just wanted to pick your brain about the possibility of, or understand what the status of this push for breaking the link between donations and lobbyists. No? The capacity of lobbyists to not only donate, but also to fundraise for candidates they lobby. Is there any chance that this is going to move in any direction in the US? I mean, either at state level or federal level? The reason I'm asking is that the OECD is actually revising the standards or its recommendation for lobbying for OECD countries. And this is an area that is still not there, but I believe it could take a lot of inputs from the US experience as well.
Go ahead.
Well, I'll just share that as part of the sweeping reforms that passed in Connecticut. Sometimes when you get politicians together that say, we're going to change everything, they kind of go all the way. And so they passed a complete ban on lobbyist contributions that was challenged in court, and we lost the ban. But the good news is there was, the fix to that was a pretty small contribution limit. So the perception, even though the scandal didn't really have to do with lobbyists in Connecticut, it was definitely part of the sweeping reforms. A complete ban was passed. It was not, they have a right to speak and give contributions, but that was able to be modified to the extent that they have a smaller contribution limit in Connecticut than other givers do.
Meredith.
So it's worth looking at Connecticut.
Meredith.
I can speak to as well, there really are a patchwork of solutions that are being tested in the states. At the federal level, the solution is really limited to disclosure. Federal lobbyists are required to disclose on a semi-annual basis their personal political contributions. But at the state level, there are other creative options. One state in particular, Pennsylvania, has a requirement that organizations who are registered lobbyists or lobbyist employers have to disclose the source of any source of funding that has given more than 10% of the organization's revenue in a calendar quarter. And so, excuse me, that's one way that that state has gotten at disclosure by getting to the sources of funding who are behind the individual lobbyists. So not just the individual lobbyist contributions, but the sources of funding behind their employers. So that's one solution. Other solutions we see are bans on contributions during session. If you are actively lobbying a legislature, you cannot make a contribution while that legislature's in session. And other sort of timing type requirements that don't get to a full ban, but they do try to mitigate the source. Other states prohibit lobbyists from being the person to deliver a contribution, so that the direct connection or the direct potential for corruption is perhaps mitigated. So in the states, we are seeing a variety of solutions to both deter lobbyist contributions or to bring transparency to them or to bring transparency to who their employers are and how they're funded.
Thanks, Meredith. So we are just about at time, so I think I'll just wrap up by thanking all of our panelists for their offering their insights today, and invite any of you to come up and chat with us. And I think we'd be happy to exchange information and follow up if folks have further questions or are interested in sharing their experiences with us. So thank you all.